Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us on Table Talk, which is a series of conversations I've been having since earlier this year, which is conversations about food. It's not a cooking show, it's not a recipe show in that sense, but cooking and recipes may come up, but it's about topics that are adjacent to food and the way that we interact with food, which is pretty much leaves me a very, very wide canvas. Uh, Today, my guest is Chef Manu Chandra. Manu, I've met, I think actually met him only a couple of times, but eaten his food far more. And Manu has agreed to join us, probably because he is now on a little sabbatical and has time. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to get him, I think, on a Sunday night to come and join us. But Manu, thank you for joining us. Welcome to Table Talk.
Thank you for having me. And I'm available all days of the week these days.
Right. So, what I'd like to start Table Talk with is usually just asking our guest about their early food memories, the formative ones. I mean, I do remember you saying that you started cooking as a very young boy and really enjoyed food, which is kind of unusual in India and in fact in many parts of the world for a male child to be interested in cooking. So what are your early memories of food in kitchens and what got you to like and want to experiment with cooking as a young lad?
Well, uh, I grew up in a very large family. I, of course, grew up in Delhi, bustling urban center, but a large family nonetheless, which was a Kayasth family. And my mom, of course, was the mix, a combination of Punjabi and Tambram. Uh, and her side of the family lived literally across the road. So not only were we a large family, but we always had a very large gathering at home. And food, of course, played a very instrumental role in our day-to-day activities, not only from a sustenance point of view, but just the way everything was organized. And when you had so many mouths to feed on any given day, the activity at home was usually around either food or the bar. So I think that was kind of ingrained in my DNA at a very early age. You always saw the grandmothers uh, preparing, one grandmother especially. Both were great cooks, but one was a lot more hands-on, very active. The other one was a bit of a princess who kind of retired after starting a very successful business. So she would go out to the defense club and play her rummy, while my paternal grandmother, of course, would do all the heavy lifting as far as cooking was concerned. So it was unavoidable, and it was always very in your face. So there was no way you could escape it. And if you lived in a 3-bedroom house with like 25 people there constantly, there was no place to hide either, so because as far as the pecking order went, senior relatives would basically get dibs to the bedrooms. So you'd basically be saddled with a gadda in the drawing room and constantly be next to the kitchen. And I think that's really where the involvement started at some level. And I think also the Kayasts are generally a very cool set as far as cooking is concerned. Male child, no male child, doesn't really matter. The men also participate in cooking. Mostly in the meat cooking, it's a bit of the American barbecue syndrome where the guys will say, okay, if the meat's being cooked, mutton always, chicken was a big no-no, and occasional, but they'd always sort of do the bunai and the cooking of the meat. And so, like I said, it didn't really matter, male child or not, the guys were always involved in some way or the other. So, yeah, I mean, formative memories are essentially always around food in some ways. Of course, there's a lot more granularity to it. There was just, an incredible range of very complex preparations that took place through the year, which you saw in some form or the other, whether you were cognizant of what it was or not is, of course, a different matter. But, in winters, there was just pickles being made all the time. There would be these little mungodis and vadis made that would be dried in the sun in the veranda or on the chat. there would be, in summer, my grandmother would collect the seeds of all the squashes that we get, all the, what's the thing called? Melons, and try those. And then through winter, she'd sit at this little chabutra of ours where the sun came in, because of course it was quite cold and non-smoggy at that time, but sit down and peel every single seed with a pair of tweezers and collect them in a large jar, so she could turn them into a kulfi towards the end of summer. So a lot of painstaking sort of processes which you, as you grew older in that house, you became more aware of and more fascinated by, and somehow participated at some level. Coming back from school, that process would still be on. Through the evening, that process would still be on. Early in the morning, that process would begin again. So, like I said, the activity, the bustle was always around food in many ways.
Okay. So your cooking as such, when did that start? Was that?
I mean, I just segged from that, and let's say the bunai, you'd step on a stool and say, okay, let me have a go at it, and keep stirring the pot. Or if koftas were being made, you'd sit down and help. I mean, you wouldn't see it all the way through. You just do 10, 15 pieces when there was like, a couple of hundred being made. But that's when I started getting my hands dirty. And usually all of us, we were three brothers and a sister who came in later. Yeah, I mean, must have started at the age of 8, 9, 10. It was an activity. And I think now when you see it on social media, it's all these cute videos of little kids, standing on benches and cooking, and there's virality around it, but that really was the process.
Right. And when did you decide that this is what you wanted to do? That the preparation of food was going to be your work?
So that was that I think that was a little more complex. I had decided at one point of time, towards the end of school, that this was a fascinating profession. And I was unanimous in that, but it wasn't something that the family backed. And that's a story that you hear a lot of chefs, say that it was always considered a vocational course, and well, it just wasn't very glamorous. And I came from a combination of a background of scholars and army guys and businessmen. So becoming a chef really wasn't on anyone's, priority list. So of course, there was a lot of effort on everyone's part to dissuade me, and I almost got dissuaded, but I didn't really give up. And I still felt that this was my calling, and I seemed to be good at it. Of course, I was doing a lot of part-time work during school itself, as well as into college later, which I'll get to that part of the story later. So there was one thing that was made very clear to me, and it's funny because I kind of repeat this to a lot of, aspiring chefs and kids who are like in class 8 or class 9 or class 10, who want to come for advice already because they've seen MasterChef Australia and they suddenly want to be chefs and think it's a glam profession. And that bit of advice was get an education, because that's really going to hold you in very good stead. And it's really going to be your fallback option if things go south in the vocational profession that you plan to pursue. So adamant that I decided to apply to only one college. And in the meantime, I went ahead and gave all my hotel management interviews, the Pusas and the IHM Mumbai's, and Waksha was school in Manipal. And I got through all of them. And of course, it was very exciting. But two things happened simultaneously. One is that when I went for my interview to Manipal, I had this fascinating interview with a panel of people, and I'd aced my scores. And I think somebody asked me in that panel, what do you like to read? And I said, currently I'm, obsessing about science fiction and fantasy. So I'm reading a lot of that. So like, oh, science fiction. So can you tell me the name of the science fiction writer who is wheelchair bound? I said, yes, I can tell you the name of a writer who's wheelchair bound, but he's not a science fiction writer. You should read your books before you call somebody who's a pure scientist a science fiction writer. So that really offended him. And I said, oh God, I've just blown this interview. And after it was done, somebody from that panel got up and asked me to, walk outside with them, took me to a coffee shop, made me sit down and have a cup of coffee. And he said, look, it's funny. He said, you seem too smart to be in this business. And I said, what does that mean? He said, it's usually people who are not being able to make it, in regular courses who seem to gravitate to these. My advice to you is that you just go and pursue some kind of, regular course if you can, and always, come back to this industry later if you need to. So that happened, and I kind of took that to heart. And, when you're like 18, 19, you do take these things to heart. And especially if it's coming from somebody who's in a position of authority and clearly has been around in this business for a very long time. And one more thing, he said, he picked up this tie and he said, this is the only glamour in this industry, and there is really nothing else. Simultaneously, I managed to somehow get into the interview for the other college, that the only college that I had applied to. And the idea behind that was that if I applied to that one college, which was impossible to get into, then at least everyone will just concede and say, yeah, go ahead and do hotel management. And so I headed back to Delhi and I went for that interview because when you basically got through an interview, and after the interview process, they would decide whether you got in full time or not. And that was really, really, I think, one of the most fun interviews I've had, because there was this panel again of extremely scholarly, serious looking, academics. And we started having a conversation. I said, okay, so what do you like to do? I said, I like to cook. They said, really? And you want to apply for a history course at St. Stephen's? I said, yes. They said, all right, so tell us what you like to cook. And for the next hour, we had the most freewheeling conversation about food and food history and ingredients and, preservation of old recipes, my mixed background and the things that I picked up from there. And towards the end of the interview, I think Upinder Singh stepped in and she's like, okay, I mean, this has been a great conversation, but do you know anything about history also? And the next 10 minutes was spent on history. And and I got selected. So I ended up going to Stephen's instead. And, I think I'm very grateful for that, because if anything, that's held me in better stead as a professional than possibly the other choice I would have made. And post that, I went off to the US to this, culinary school, which I was very fascinated by. And so that's how I got into the profession.
So how did you go about getting into the Culinary Institute of America?
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of easy.
Why?
Why? Oh, so there was a trigger for that as well. That probably happened. I can't remember now, class 9 maybe. And there was an article in either the Education Times. There used to be an Education Times that used to come as a supplement once a week or something.
Yeah.
And all the colleges from across the world used to do their ads in that and make pitches. And for this rare moment, there was a culinary school that made a pitch with a picture of a cake, which had me so blown that I was like, how is that even possible? How can anyone make a cake like that? And I was into baking at that time, right? I mean, a lot of people start off with baking and cakes and all that. And it was, I think, an Alice in Wonderland themed cake, which was this bizarre, lopsided 3-tier giant structure with a teapot sitting, at the pinnacle, with tea coming out of the teapot, falling into a cup and splashing out. And that was a cake. So,
right.
and it looked like exactly what I'm describing. I said, this is not humanly possible. I said, I want to go there. This is the place I definitely want to go to. And I kind of bookmarked that and I said, someday. And then, of course, I saw the fee structure and it was frightfully expensive. And I was like, this is out of the question. There's no way that my parents are going to spend this kind of money to send me to some fancy, undergrad course. and yeah, I mean, that kind of stuck with me. And then I reapplied. And of course, with all this academic credentials and great recommendation letters. And I mean, they said you don't even have to take the TOEFL and SATs. It's not necessary. You seem to have the requisite education. And given that you have a certain level of education, we're going to give you a whole bunch of scholarships as well. And post that is going to be meritorious. So yeah, that worked out. And the visa wasn't difficult either. So yeah, it was a bit of a breeze, I mean, to be honest. And I think increasingly, I'm not sure to say this, but it's become so frightfully expensive that I think the only credentials you need is a bank balance. So if you can afford to get in, you probably do. And it has a very high dropout rate as well. And very, very high dropout rate because while it sounds and seems, like a bit of a Hogwarts, which it was, it's punishing. And a lot of kids who came in for undergrad, for the undergrad courses straight out of high school, they weren't used to that kind of schedule. I was already working part-time, so I was used to it. But no. So there would always be vacancies and they need to fill them. It's much larger than what it used to be, I believe. I mean, it's almost 2x, 3x larger now. A lot of Indian students, when I went there, I think there was 3. I think all of them, they continued to stay there. I mean, nobody wanted to come back because once you got the visa and the ticket to the US, there was no way that you're coming back. So I think that was also a very large part of my sort of inspiration. I wanted to come back. And I decided that before I left that I did not want the green card. I did not want to live there. I wanted to come back and do something else.
You talked about all the part-time stuff you did in school and college. What kind of work were you doing?
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is where you have to, understand that this is where I'm kind of seasoned because I was cooking in Khan Market before Khan Market was known as the Khan Market Gang, and there was nothing in Khan Market. There was a little cafe, and a very dear friend of mine from college, I think early first year, we like to go to fancy places to have coffee because that's the only thing that we could afford at fancy places. Yeah. And so we went there. This was called Cafe Turtle, and it was quite a Gora hangout in Khan Market. And Khan Market was generally largely a Gora hangout. And we heard somebody sitting at the next table, extremely distressed and saying, I don't know how I'm going to do this. We've been wanting to do good quality food over here, but all we serve is cookies and, some bakes or whatever. And I wish somebody could help us. And of course, both our ears perked up. And Ratna, this friend of mine, she walked up to the lady and she's like, my friend will do it. So I was volunteered into a chef's role at this cafe, in your teenage years, essentially. And and I started. So I used to prep at home after college, and I used to take the stuff over there and finish it and serve a bunch of very delighted guests because I was doing interesting stuff. Who, I think only Ritu was doing that at a more fine dining format in Delhi at that point, or maybe a handful of hotels. But making fresh crostinis, rubbing it with garlic, dicing fresh tomatoes, adding basil, which I would source from here and there because these were all still fancy vegetables. You got them only in Khan Market, ironically. Mm-hmm. And toss up really fresh food out of an OTG. I mean, that's the only thing I had to work with. Right. And I remember, I think it must have been 6 months or 7 months in, this very loud man walked in wearing a solar topi. I think he had a ring on every finger and, very loud sort of voice. And he said, where is this bacha I've been hearing about who's doing amazing food? And he walks up to the counter. He's like, main sab kuch khaunga, give me one of everything that you make. And it was GV Sethi. And GV, was like my first patron and years later became a great friend. I mean, God rest his soul, he passed away last year. But what a remarkable man. And he started talking about it to everybody. And he was quite the Delhi socialite, and suddenly you had all these people showing up and there were press articles that there's this college boy who's doing, professional cooking at this little cafe in Khan Market. So yeah, it was a fun ride. And I also did part-time work at the Maurya Sheraton at that time. which wasn't allowed technically because you had to be a hotel management graduate to even step in, and be a trainee over there. But thanks to my parents' left-leaning friends, they had somebody who was the head of the union over there. And of course, I have a friend who's the head of the union, you can do whatever you want. And so I was sort of ushered in there also. And that was also very punishing, but you'd have to do full-time school. So I did that before Cafe Turtle. So full-time school and then finish that and go and do a full-time shift. You'd be completely exhausted. And I was, I was quite wily at that time. And but it was a fascinating learning experience because kitchens were very, very different at that time. And I understood at some level why there was so much skepticism about joining the industry per se. The failure rate was very high. There was no glam chefs at that time. Sanjeev Kapoor had just burst on to the scene, with Khana Khazana or whatever his first show was. Yeah, it was a different time, but those were essentially the pre-CIA experiences and fascinating ones. And when I was in culinary school, I continued to work part-time at different places as much as I could, because getting to Manhattan was a longish ride. It was a 2.5-hour ride. So you have to program it in such a way that you could get there to some of the most celebrated restaurants, manage your classes in a way that you could double them up so that you'd get a longer weekend and go and stage at different, now all Michelin starred restaurants, but the Michelin stars weren't in New York at that time. So New York Times was essentially the greatest, validator of restaurants and rater of restaurants, reviewer of restaurants. And so I managed to get my foot in the door at some really great spaces and work under phenomenal chefs for short periods of time, but that's enough sometimes.
Okay. So the Maurya experience was right. You were still in school at that time.
Yes.
Yeah. But all along this would be dead sure that this was what you wanted to do eventually. There was no wavering in that.
I would say so. I dabbled with trying to do international relations, and then I got very fascinated with defense studies also. I even applied for international relationships at SOAS and Warwick and stuff, and I think I even got into one of them. But I had good recommendation letters, I had good grades, but something just kept pulling me towards this. I figured that I think this might just work for me, and it did. I think it.
So what about the CIA years then? How did those go? I mean, it sounds like it was pretty damn hectic.
It was, but it was also amazing in so many ways because you realize that you suddenly arrived. It was, coming of age in many ways, and that too in a place like New York was great. 9/11 had just happened, and it was a very different world. And being a brown boy suddenly in the midst of all of this would have most people worried, but mercifully, nothing untoward ever happened. When you're around people who think alike, the learning is very different. And when you have teachers who have, and most of them really had a very simple philosophy, and they'd oft repeat it. They're like, look, we have the infrastructure, we have the wherewithal, we have the knowledge to impart, but this is the type of trade where you will only be able to glean as much as you put in. So that's really the mantra for any level of success at this institute. And again, that's something that I took to heart. Like I said, I think for me, a distinct advantage was having an education already under my belt. So it made things a lot easier. Structuring was easier. Management was much easier. Managing time was much easier. So yeah, I ended up doing really well for myself at school, and finished class valedictorian or batch valedictorian, whatever it's called, which basically means the highest grades, which I think was a combination of both the educational background as well as the fact that I was working, and that kind of opened up many doors because when you're in that sort of space, getting into different restaurants, etc., becomes much easier. Great recommendations that come along with it. So I could have actually pursued the whole green card path. Yeah, I didn't. And a couple other really interesting things happened while I was there. It was, of course, a long period, and it's difficult for me to distill it in one conversation. I had applied, there was this huge competition that was taking place. It was a national recipe competition. It was the biggest, apparently, hosted by the Norwegian government. They were sponsoring it. And of course, this huge push for Norwegian seafood into the US. And, you know, the US is one of the largest importers of that, their products. So you had to draft this recipe and you had to submit it, and an appetizer and a main course. And if you would be shortlisted, they would reach out to you and saying that your recipe sounds interesting. Now, can you send us a step-by-step process on how you make it? So there was a few, stages involved in it. So I got the first email, surprisingly, me and another classmate of mine saying that, and of course, it was open to culinary schools from across the US. So there was some 25, 30,000 applicants for it. So yeah, I got an email saying, why don't you send us a more detailed thing, because your recipe sounds fascinating. And so did my friends. So both of us sort of became the finalists, who would then go to Manhattan to actually cook in front of a bunch of judges. And there were, kids from across the US who were picked. I think there was 14 or 15 of us. And there was this huge theater set up in Soho. And there's a remarkable panel, very intimidating, because you had Eric Ripert, who was, of course, the star chef in New York at that time, at Le Bernardin. You had Rick Moonen, you had Michael Lomonaco, I can't even remember everyone's name. Marcus Samuelson, the guy who was, reviving, doing this whole Finnish cuisine in the US, and he was quite the star at that time, Ethiopian Finnish guy, Finnish or Swedish, something like that. And so, yeah, very intimidating jury, and they were all sitting like that. This is the third panel that I'm talking about. So clearly a lot of my life has been defined by panels and juries of some kind. So I had actually a very interesting recipe, even though I say so myself, but I can understand why it made it to the finals, because these were flavor profiles that the US had not seen. And interestingly, neither had the judges. It was modern Indian, I think, before the term was coined or whatever.
Yep.
And so I actually did a little bit of plagiarism there, in the sense of a technique. I didn't really use, which is fine, you can copy a technique. And it was Alain Ducasse's technique, who at that time was considered the god. He was the man with the most Michelin stars in France, one of the most revered chefs across the globe. And he had a very interesting method of cooking fish en papillote, which may sound like a classic technique, which is, you take fish and put it in a piece of parchment paper, roll it up and bake it. This was a lot more sort of nuanced, because he'd take a very delicate fish, which has a tendency of overcooking very quickly, cut it almost like sashimi, and layered it, between two sheets of paper, and just let it kiss a very hot pan and flip it on either side. So, and then just peel that paper off. So that fish is just perfectly cooked. And if you had really high quality fish. So I did that in a fan, and it was cod, Norwegian cod. And I took the skin off and I turned that into crisps, because I was a little inspired by what Charlie Trotter was doing in Chicago at that time, and Thomas Keller was doing at the French Laundry. These guys were also, just sort of rising stars at the time. But I glazed the fish with mustard oil. Then I put a little toasted kalonji on it, and I had a rice that I made a little pulao out of, and I really can't remember what I added to it. Something desi, this I remember. And I took cilantro root, and I crushed that with, I have forgotten, and made a vinaigrette, which basically accompanied that fish. So it was there was big flavors also, but there was a lot of subtlety. And the cooking technique was very fascinating for the judges who were sitting in front. And I think Eric Ripert said, "Where do you learn that technique?" I said, "Alain Ducasse." He's like, "Yeah, that's very impressive if you're doing a Ducasse technique." And it was cooked perfectly. It was served up. And so I won. And there was only one winner. And so I got like an all expenses paid scholarship to Scandinavia. before the Scandinavian movement ever took place or off, etc. The only 2 Michelin-star restaurant in Oslo and Norway called Bagatelle, which was very French. And so I show up to this completely alien country with, lots of money because it was an all paid, and staying at the SAS, which was the fanciest hotel in town. And of course, when the Norwegian Seafood Council is basically sponsoring everything, they go all out. I'm standing here in this large sort of mansion of a building, which is Bagatelle, and I'm almost 6 feet tall. So I'm not short by any measure, but when you go to Norway, you realize that even 6 feet is short. And I'm standing in this foyer, sort of waiting for the chef to show up, and maybe I'll get a guided tour or whatever it is. And there's this gorgeous, large flower arrangement over there, very, very sexy restaurant. And suddenly this door bursts open. I mean, it's a scene out of a movie, and in charge these 2 giant hounds, large dogs. And behind them, holding them on a leash, is some 6'9" Nordic guy with this flowing white hair, who's the chef. His name was Ivan Hellström, actually one of the most celebrated chefs in Scandinavia and also the world at that time. So I mean, as they say in Hindi, "Meri to phatli." I was like, what the hell is going on? How am I going to work with this guy? But it was a very cool experience. And I saw a very different side of cooking, and I saw a very different side of flavor building. It's also the first time I discovered foraging, and all the slaves in the kitchen used to be Japanese, because at that time the Japanese were basically spreading across the world and working as free labor in every major restaurant, and they would take all this knowledge and basically move back to Japan and set up their own restaurants. They would sit down and brush every mushroom with a little toothbrush type thing, so you could get the dust off. You never wash mushrooms, really good girolles or chanterelles, and there would always be a hint of New Nordic in the food. And the movement was just taking off. But Bagatelle was very grounded in French, because at that time, French still kind of ruled the roost. And, there was an all-out New Nordic movement. There was a couple of restaurants called Oro. There were very different benchmarks at that time. Competitions were very different. So Bocuse d'Or used to be huge. I mean, it still is, but not so relevant anymore, in my opinion. I can be corrected if I'm wrong. But yeah, so and then I went off to Bergen, which is such a beautiful country. I mean, how can you not fall in love with the fjords and pretty countries like that? And then I ate whale for the first time, and moose and elk and all kinds of weird stuff. And yeah, I'm not sure I want to eat a lot of that again, but it was an interesting learning experience. And you're at a stage where you want to learn as much. And I think some of the most fascinating things I discovered there was that baking culture is phenomenal. So some of the best breads I ever had was over there. So my memories of good sourdough are still from then. Years later, of course, I started doing that at Toast and Tonic. But I think it's things like that sort of inspire you in your journey as a chef at any given point. So there was a lot to tap into. Yeah, so that gives you some sense of the CIA years.
And then, I mean, with all of this behind you, you could have got yourself a job pretty much anywhere in the world, right?
Yeah.
You chose, I mean, were there options that you looked at before deciding that you would come back? I mean, you said that you had that intention. You did want to come back. But a lot of people go with that intention of coming back, but when they see a very different kind of life and see a lot of what the world has to offer, change their minds. And there's nothing wrong with that. But you did decide to come back. So why was that?
So, I mean, honestly, how do I say this without sounding disparaging at some level? Oh, fuck it, I'll sound disparaging if I have to. So, see, the easy path to green card was always to work in places which were short of labor and desperate for it. And that was never, ever the good restaurants or the good hotels. They're not short of staff. They have Japanese slaves, lined up, waiting to work there for free for a year. Call them whatever you want, but first it was Japanese, then it became Chinese, and a lot of people, the Spaniards came in, the English came in. Everyone wanted to train under big name chefs because so they were never short of staff. People who are short of staff are the ones who are throwing, work permits and green cards. So if you wanted to really work there, you would go to some Marriott Bonvoy in, Tallahassee and essentially get it. You wouldn't go to a 3-star Michelin restaurant and get it. It was out of the question. This is the one thing I definitely decided for myself, that if I want to work, I want to work at the best places. And if you're working at the best places, fat chance that they're going to sponsor any kind of visa. And I have to say that I lucked out on that front also, because the last job that I held was the opening team of the Mandarin Oriental, which was really the new Twin Towers in New York, and it was at Columbus Circle. Jazz at Lincoln Center was going to open up over there. The world's, it was just world's many firsts and big. And the Mandarin wasn't a very large group at that time. This was their 3rd or 4th hotel, and their biggest so far, and also one of the biggest openings that New York has ever seen. It was a very high pressure job with a hand-picked team, extremely, extremely talented, hardworking people, gorgeous structure. And they were willing to offer anything. If they got the best people, they were willing to hold on to them. So the possibility existed. I just, didn't really want to exercise it. So then I'll finish my time and I'll head back. So,
So, my question was not necessarily the US, but other parts of the world. With this kind of resume and, the contest, the experience that you put in various kitchens and all of that kind of thing, could have landed you work in pretty much any part of the world, right?
Possibly, Peter, but I never really, I honestly, I did not explore that much.
Right.
I didn't spend too much time trying to look for opportunities in different parts. There are lots of great chefs, etc. But there was also a time when I knew I need to start off stuff on my own, because otherwise I'll just constantly keep working under people. And I'd seen that. And I'd worked with sous chefs who'd worked with big name chefs for practically all their lives. They were well into their 30s. They were always very frustrated and angry. And I think during one of my stints over there, during my stint over there, one of them actually ended up opening a very high-end restaurant. We found an investor, right? Which is a big thing, that you find yourself an investor. It opened to glowing reviews because this guy had just worked under all the big names. And it shut after 7 months because, poor chap, the only thing he knew was how to cook. He didn't know anything about the business. And it was a great thing. And ironically, it was around the corner from the place I was staying at near Washington Square Park, but failed. The failure rate is very, very high. So I think I also knew that it was the right time to sort of branch out and do something on my own, which probably wouldn't have been possible at that age in a New York sort of scenario. This is all pre-social media. So you really had to work for your bread. There was no posting anything. You had to slum it out, and that's how you'd get noticed, if you were lucky. There was a very limited number of variables that would work in your favor. It wasn't like I put out this school picture and I suddenly become the star chef. Bollocks to that, no chance. You had to really, really, really sweat it out, 18, 19 hours a day sometimes. I still have a pay stub, I think, from that last job. My overtime, I'm not kidding when I say this, my overtime was nearly 100 hours in the week. So, I was living in the hotel. I would finish an 18-hour shift or a 17-hour shift. I would take a shower and come back pretty, maybe an hour's nap or 2 hours nap, have a cup of coffee and be back at work. It was very different to what it is now. And I think I was able to take a lot of that and sort of channel it into the next thing that I wanted to do, which I wasn't completely sure of, to be honest. It was a bit of shot in the dark. My mom and dad would keep sending me press clippings of, restaurants opening up in India. And they just felt that it was the right time. I didn't think so. And when I did come back, I sort of said that, let me come back for a few months and see how it goes, right? If it's really dismal, then I'll probably head back for a couple more years. That's maybe the next part of the story.
Mm. So yes, so then you came back, and what happened next? What did you look at? What were the options?
Frustration, depression, tantrums, and like what the hell is going on? Of course, the first thing is the moment you land after some years of living in the US, you have to get rid of the rolling of the R's and the twang. And everyone picks up a little bit of an accent. Okay, maybe not everyone, I did. And so, of course, I was mocked for the first week and I got rid of it very quickly. The second was my palate had now been so attuned to eating Michelin star ready food that the moment even something mildly spicy hit my palate, I would just go ballistic. I'd become very angry because I was like, oh my God, my senses have been violated, even though I'd grown up with it. But that's what happens, if you sort of um, uh, what's it called? Your palate gets conditioned into cleaner flavors, and you're making these amazing sauces and all that, and you look for nuance, and then here comes that dal tadka with the green chilies thrown in, winter chilies that too, which have that extra kick in it. It's like fire all over. So I had to kind of reacclimatize to that whole thing, and then I said, okay, let me start checking out the restaurant scene. Some friends helped, and maybe family friends helped set up with some very, very senior chefs. I remember meeting Arvind Saraswat at that time. I think he had been moved to the Taj Sats division, and the guy was a legend, of course, in the Taj circles and all that. I hadn't really heard very much about him, but then I had the more US bent and the European bent, and fascinating conversation, fascinating operation, those Taj Sats operations, and I don't really remember very much of that conversation, to be honest. And then I met Ritu Dalmia, who I've always kind of vibed with. And, we had endless cigarettes and coffees at her new cafe in GK on the rooftop. And basically said, "Bacha, just pack your bags and go back. What are you doing over here?" Then I think I tried to reach out to, I was more interested in the standalone scene because that's really where, that was something I enjoyed a lot. Hotels, hotels. And at that time, since I'd already done some level of hotel and Indian hotels as well. Then I think I tried to reach out to Rahul in Bombay, but he was busy or something. And then a chance meeting with one of my old friends, like, oh, I have a really dear friend who has a really dear friend who's opened this great restaurant in Mehrauli. Maybe you should meet. So a call was set up, and that's when I spoke to AD, and I said, look, I've just come back from the US, and you have a job. And AD was like, we're always looking for people who return because people don't want to return, they want to settle there, etc. The whole thing happened. And it's also a story that I've told many times. So I decided to meet him in Olive Mehrauli, which had just opened, I think, a couple of months before this meeting. It was brand new. It was, of course, very hot because of the pedigree that it enjoyed in Bombay as being the Bollywood hangout. And I think Ajay Devgan denied entry into the space. And Karan Johar being denied entry into the space. So that was big news all over the press. And the one thing I did pick up from New York is because it was cold weather, you picked up the right sort of clothes, and I had a thin, lean frame, so I was a bit of a natty dresser. So I was wearing this long, knee-length overcoat, some nice fancy red T-shirt inside, big boots with the jeans tucked in, big spiky hair, and I was waiting, and AD walked in and he looked around and clearly didn't find the person he was looking for. So he asked the desk girl again, he's like, somebody must have come for job interview. So she pointed at me, and AD was wearing a red T-shirt with a knee-length overcoat and boots, and it was like this mirror thing, and he's like, "You're the chef?" I was like, "Yes." He's like, "Oh, great." I mean, I was hired at that point. I don't think there needed to be an interview beyond that. And so, we had a great long conversation, and I like the fact that he was upfront and saying that I've always had great ideas. I've been able to build a couple of great restaurants. He told me about his past, ventures, and how it's always such a struggle to look for good young chefs in India. And he said, "Would you like to work here?" I said, "No. I mean, I would ideally want to move elsewhere because the thought of moving back home immediately was a little too much." And so he said, "We've been thinking about opening in Bangalore, and would you like to head that up?" So I was like, "Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm too young for that right now, but we can still figure it out." And the rest, as they say, is history. So
So how was it then when you came into Bangalore? How did history go?
It was nice. I mean, it was a quiet little town. You could play cricket on the roads. Nobody complained about traffic because there wasn't any. And I think I fell in love with this lovely old bungalow on Wood Street. It was very European. I had nothing, I had no concept about the market. And I think Sunny's was really, the place. And he just opened his newest venue. He closed the old one. The new venue, which was, now he has got a newer one, but Arjun. And UB City hadn't been so here I was at the fanciest so-called restaurant in Bangalore, and it was interesting. So I knew that there was definitely opportunity. There wasn't very much going on. It was, the pub city had started declining by then. There wasn't really so much pub action happening. A lot of expats. Because of tech, because of banking, there was a lot of expats, and I figured that if we would be able to capture that segment in doing a slightly high-end European restaurant, that may just work. It didn't really work that well. Not for the first couple of years. It was difficult because I think I'd just come in with all of this, experience and stuff, and I was essentially cooking like I was cooking over there. But that didn't fly. That didn't fly with a lot of customers because it was way ahead of its time. It just didn't make sense to them. They were still, chicken steak and mushroom sauce. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I guess my granddad was eating that when he went out for continental food. It was still called continental. So there wasn't very much in terms of progress. I'd heard there was a place out on the outskirts of Bangalore. I mean, credit where credit is due. Called Grasshopper, which was doing some interesting work. I'd never really been there. Yeah, but like I said, there wasn't very much happening over there. So it was a tough year and a half, and I think we were rescued in the large part because of the expat population, and because this resonated with them. This made sense to them. This is the food they were looking for, which may not have been true for a lot of the Indian audiences, well-heeled or not. So that was a huge learning. It was difficult. It was challenging. Staff was difficult. Working with people who are older than you is difficult, especially when you're a young boss. And but yeah, I mean, it's been 17 years. I mean, I can't believe it. It's been a long time, but it was definitely a very different city, and I think a lot of credit is due to that restaurant for actually opening up the doors to Bangalore for people from across the country, and saying that if these guys can actually open and be successful over there, then it's time for all of us to move in. So in many ways, it was the beacon that started the, Bangalore is probably one of the biggest F&B cities in the country right now.
Very much.
I'd say that it probably started with that.
You touched on this when you were talking about your first conversation with AD, and where you said that you wondered whether you were too young to take on the role. All right. So how did you deal with that? How did you deal with that, being the young boss, going in there and making it happen?
Yeah, it's very easy. Just yell the loudest. that always worked. And of course, it's different now. I was nurturing also, but at the end, I was also very short and ill-tempered, and I won't deny that. I've had many Gordon Ramsay moments for very long periods of time. When I say long periods of time, let's just put it to a few years. But and that's something that I've grappled with for a long time. It's not that I have anger management issues. I'm not usually just an angry person. I may be a sulk, but I'm not an angry person. And if anyone wants to chip in and write a comment, they can do that here if they don't agree. But it was just so difficult at so many levels, because you're just used to a certain structure, you're used to a certain level of consistency, you also used to a certain level of perfection, because at the end of the day, when you're setting the bar very high, you need to be able to make yourself happy before you can even start thinking about the customer. And in this case, everything would just fall apart. Supply chains were a mess. Things would come in half rotten. Fish would come in smelling, which was fine if you were going to fry the crap out of it and douse it in some kind of sauce. You just won't be able to tell. So suppliers had gotten into the habit of passing off all kinds of rubbish. So there was one battle over there. The other battle was actually with the systems, because the systems were all over the place. So it wasn't really running like a well-oiled machine should. There was too much ad hoc involved in, it was professional, but at some level also not. And I won't say that it's a lack of professionalism that would show. It was just the streamlining and making sure that it's run like a tight operation. That was another frustration. And there was the staff, because you essentially have to start dealing with people who never had dealt with this kind of food before, who would not even eat this kind of food or taste this kind of food. So how do you train them? So it was essentially training everyone from scratch. It's many things happening at the same time. So it really bears down, especially when you're very young, it bears down on you even more. So what do? You yell and a little more. And that at least keeps some pieces in check, right? While you're tackling this fire and the others are quiet, and then you're basically moving from troubleshoot to troubleshoot. And I think that's how essentially a lot of the early years went. And slowly but surely, those teams started getting better. I have to say, though, in all of this, the attrition was still very low, and largely because they were just learning something completely new every day. Stuff that I'd learned. And I always told them, listen, I went and got a fancy education. I'm giving this to you for free. So stick around and learn it. These are techniques that you've never worked with. I was doing sous vide cooking out then, before, like I said, I have to keep taking breaks to make sure I don't say the wrong thing. Oh, it's okay if I do. But yeah, doing it way before anybody else was doing it in the country. But you're just not talking about it. And I think that's also kind of defined me or my style for a very long time. I don't necessarily feel the need to stand on top of a mountain and keep screaming about what I do in the kitchen. If the customer can't take cognizance of it, then then you're doing something wrong. As far as the media is concerned, I'd rather just not go there. For them, Bangalore was always, it was never on their radar. They were just so busy with Delhi and Bangalore wasn't on their radar. They're so busy with Delhi and Bombay all the time that for them, basically the world did not exist before outside of these two places. So, even if I had Noma parked in Bangalore, these guys wouldn't really notice, because everyone is so wow about very shami kebabs. So I think we did a lot of remarkable work in those years also. Some of the dishes I still look back on and I'm saying, my God, they're still ahead of their time. I still think some of these would be a hard sell. Maybe now in some tasting format, only fancy, 20,000 rupee a head place, it will fly. But I'm actually very proud of that, because a lot of the people who work there picked that up, and bits of it or techniques of it. Just working with dough, for example, that was a nightmare in itself, getting non-rancid flour, trying to figure out how to develop gluten when there was none, and making really, really nice baguettes. So my first thing that I would walk in, and I'd come to work very, very early at that time. And I was always the first one in and the last one out, 7 days a week. I'd walk into the bakery and I'd stand next to the baker and we'd do this sound test. We'd stand next to each other and we'd keep a piece of baguette between our ears. And I said, when I crunch it and I hear that crackling glass sound, we've got the bread right. Otherwise, this batch needs to be thrown out and you will do it again. And I did that many times. And I lost a couple of bakers, but that's how we got it right. And it was free bread that went down in the bread basket, but that mattered to me. So you see, that was essentially the training that I came from. That was the level of perfection that when you opened a fine restaurant, that was the kind of output required. And it may have been mismatched completely with customer expectations, who were maybe not expecting that. They were expecting a nice soft bread, which doesn't crackle or sound like glass, or contraire, they want it to sound like nothing at all. But yeah, I didn't care. I mean, my job was to put out a good product, and that's really what I was doing. Did I strike some level of compromise later? I did. Yes, in an interesting way, really. I mean, I didn't necessarily let go of what I'd learned. I just said, okay, just bring in some other elements on the menu, which, is the crowd pleaser. I don't necessarily want to get involved in that too much. You guys know how to do it anyway, because you probably learned it in the last cafe you worked at, and that's fine. I mean, if it keeps 5 out of 10 people happy, at least I'll still have 10 people in the restaurant, and that was enough to make it profitable.
So what were some of these dishes that you look back on and say that they're still ahead of their time?
So we did a lot, a lot of advanced techniques, a lot of deconstructing stuff without really, making it look too pretentious, but doing interesting iterations on it. I remember I had a dish called Seven Little Pigs, which was an assiette of pork, and each component had been cooked differently, and it was a lot of work. Again, a very, high-end Michelin style dish or New York Times, 3-star, 4-star restaurant style dish. And it was painstaking. It was painstaking to put together, painstaking to prep, painstaking to finish. But what a spectacular plate it was at the end of the day. And I met a few chefs, recently, older chefs who said, one of our recollections of that restaurant is that dish that you did, because that was just such a remarkable piece of plating and concept. And these guys are senior, like executive chefs in 5-star hotels, etc. But clearly there was something that stuck with them as professionals also. They're like, wow, someone's doing this in India. We used to serve a lot of foie gras at that time. I think we were only standalone restaurant which was doing that much before something else came up at Taj, which was very good, but Gora chefs, very expensive expat chefs. I was an underpaid Lodi fellow anyway. And yeah, there was a lot, yeah, Peter. 17 years of menus. I can't start recounting them. Tasting menus we did. And that's a concept that I continued very quietly again. We didn't tom it too much. It was never printed. It was always for private dinners, but it was beautiful tasting menus broken down. I see Aditi here in one of the attendees when she'd come in to try stuff out. We turned the a la carte menu into a tasting menu, also sending little samplers as opposed to entire plates. Which I'm sure Radhika was very happy about, because she wanted the portion size to be visible. But that was such a nice way to eat. And that didn't really exist, but it started, now it's completely en vogue, but it wasn't. You didn't really see tasting menus. Yeah.
I first heard about those tasting menus only much later on.
Hmm?
I first heard about the whole concept of tasting menus around the mid 40s, because I was doing, as a copywriter, doing some restaurant menus and stuff like that, and first heard of this whole thing of tasting menus, and I was like, oh, okay, interesting. I never heard of that thing before, but yeah.
So see, more importantly, I must reiterate over here that from a standalone point of view, a lot of this did not exist. At a 5-star hotel level, perhaps it did. Maybe an Orient Express did it. Maybe a Zodiac Grill at the Taj did it. But how many people could go there? How many people could ever afford to eat there? And a standalone made it a lot more accessible. And that's really what's amazing about good standalones. In fact, that particular Bangalore outpost was the one that introduced the concept of these fun Sunday brunches. It didn't really exist in Bangalore outside of 5-star hotel, in a completely different format, where it was a single cuisine. It wasn't 20 different cuisines. It was just Mediterranean stuff, nice fresh things in little bowls which would just be refreshed, and a very pretty boutique buffet. And what a party scene that became. Every Sunday was this. It was a party, but a party where everyone was eating and drinking extremely well. It wasn't just a drinking party, and fun. I think that kept the place relevant constantly for a long time.
So what about the other restaurants then, the ones that came after Olive Beach, the other brands that you have been involved with launching? How did these come up, and what went into making them and creating these ideas?
So honestly, I have to say that sometimes it's kind of dangerous also when I do this, but sometimes I come up with the concept after I come up with the name. Uh, and it happens even with food sometimes, I'm sitting and doodling something and I put something together. I said, oh, that looks nice on paper. Maybe this should be a dish. And I start sort of reverse engineering from that point on. And sometimes I have no fucking idea what I'm doing. And I'm like, okay, this is a nice space. I like that light and I like this look. Now I'll start piecing it together somehow in my head and create some kind of product. And it's an interesting way of doing it because it's not predetermined in any way, which must be very, very annoying for people who are putting money into it. But it doesn't have to be because it just kind of comes together more organically in that sense, and it builds as opposed to this is exactly what I'm going to do. This is the Pinterest queue, and this is how the place is going to look. That's just so terribly boring. I mean, that's in my nothing fresh comes out of that really. And when you build organically, um, every day is a new inspiration. Every day is a new experience, and because it's so open-ended in some ways, to be able to assimilate that into the concept is a lot easier. So what is the DNA of the concept? You see, this is a question I've been asked for many years, especially with the new ventures. Who is your TG at Monkey Bar? I said, I don't know. I mean, last night there was an 80-year-old celebrating a birthday and she was dancing on the tables. Is she my TG? Can I put an 80-year-old dancing grandmother on tables as my TG? I can't, right? Because you'll shoot it down. There are 18-year-olds there as well. Are they my TG? Not necessarily. So I can't define my TG because, I mean, a great product should not have a TG. It should attract everybody. And I think that has largely been the backbone of how I approach my places. I never wanted them to be specifically for somebody. Take Toast and Tonic, for example. Every time, people thought I was stark raving mad for pivoting an entire brand on gin alone. They said, gin causes impotence, gin is an afternoon drink, and who drinks gin? I said, yeah, they will drink gin. And yeah, and so did, so they did. And now they're all drinking gin in their drawing rooms, in their homes, in every other restaurant. It's one of the hottest drinks out there, and it's delicious. And no one's impotent. And even if they were, I mean, we're enough as it is. In many ways, I think these brands were able to be revivalist in some ways. And I take no credit for that because they weren't intended to be revivalist. They were intended to be great products. Everyone just saw that this is a successful formula, and then they started copying it, and therefore it became revivalist. And that's how it works. So you become a saint without doing a single saintly thing. So I think by building organically and not really being too obsessed with what exactly that product is going to be from the word go, you actually are able to create a lot more freshness. And I think that's really what's defined a lot of the new ventures and brands and gave them that stickiness with the audience, because it wasn't a formula. That it became formula later for other people, I think that's testament to the fact that it was a great product. The fact that gastropub, the word, of course, is not coined by us. We just called it India's first gastropub because we used the moniker before anyone else did. There are a couple of places in the country who are definitely doing similar stuff, not similar products, but similar ethos. But they called themselves something else. And then everything happened across the country. Everybody was a gastropub. Everyone was a gastrobar, and gastro, on and on and on. So, the same thing with Fatty Bao, for example. A failure turned into a success. So the phoenix of Like That Only's closure, which was a gorgeous restaurant, was a runaway success, and Baos became mainstream. Ramens became cool. And again, because it was an approachable standalone format, which always goes a long way, I think. And then the hotels copied it. So it's reversed.
Monkey Bar?
What about it?
What went into that? I mean, how did you've touched on Tonic and a little bit about Fatty Bao, but what about, what
Well,
was,
also was the first time that, I mean, Chetan and I had formed this company, which was a subsidiary of Olive. We had to we had to invest entirely into those. Nobody was putting in any money. Chetan and I had to really front the money entirely. And that was very tough. It was very, very tough because we didn't have that kind of money. We were already not being, we weren't working some insanely paid jobs or salaries. We were great, we were loyal. And now we essentially had to park our entire life savings plus some, into building these first two restaurants. And after that, also we don't, some minority share in the company of this. But we were young and we were enthusiastic. We didn't know better, and we went ahead with that. And I think so much of it was dictated by what our bank balances were because they were practically non-existent. Chetan had to sell his parents' shop somewhere because they had one that they were, drawing some rent from. I had to go and borrow money from the market because I didn't have enough. So a lot of our decisions, and we had no way to pay it also. So if it went south, this was the end. And so a lot of how we did the place was also dictated by how much we could afford to spend, and which wasn't very much because we committed 2 restaurants, not one, and this was just the first one. So I just started building from there. Can we just salvage stuff from Chor Bazaar and make that part of the decor? There was an old lambretta lying outside. I just painted it and put it on top of the damn thing, man, and that'll become decor. Found old frames lying around in Chor Bazaar, and that became so much of the character of it. And I was walking past, and we repurposed metal from somewhere to make the booths. And like I said, every possible way to save some money also, because otherwise it would be impossible. But I wanted to make a good kitchen because that was important. I knew that if it ever gets busy, good infrastructure is really what's going to see us through. We had some very, very definitive ideas on how the service should play out and how people should be treated in the space. And it's funny, I had a meeting this morning and I was telling them my 20 whiskey tasting. I was telling them about how the staff was trained to be trained to do service. I said, not be subservient. I said, you're not anyone's servant, and you will not behave like that. And if anyone treats you like that, would be asked to leave the premises. And that's how we want to run it. We want to run an egalitarian space, first come, first serve, no bookings, share tables. All of these were firsts, and a menu which made no sense whatsoever. Because it was, as Shubhana put it, I think in a review in, was it the Mint, was that, multi-cuisine has become sexy again. And that's really what Monkey Bar was. It was a lot of favorite things. It was stuff that I enjoyed cooking, enjoyed eating, and I knew I could execute with a fair amount of quality and affordability and put it out there. And a lot of nods to, of course, Indian biodiversity, local ingredients in a pub format. Again, not seen or heard of before. Our signature cocktail was an Panna, and continues to be the #1 selling cocktail at that, 10, 12 years on. How many restaurants can you think of and instantly remember its signature cocktail? There's not very many. I mean, there's however many attendees over here. Do a little mental check yourself and saying, how many restaurants can you immediately have a cocktail pop up in your mind? And Manga became one of those things. Like at Toast and Tonic, for example, the herbalist became that. Everyone walking in said herbalist immediately before they sat down. So a good drinks program is important, but it doesn't have to be pretentious. It doesn't have to have 17 layers and 5 bubbles and 4 pieces of smoke and a cinnamon stick that's lying dead on the side, God knows why. But it just needs to be tasty. And I think that really was the DNA of the brand. Be tasty, be unpretentious, love everyone, that works. And we didn't have very many people in the first 4 or 5 days, of course, with all that money sunk in, I thought, "Bas, ab to band baj gaye. I don't know what's going to happen." And then I don't know what happened. But whatever happened continued to happen for a very, very long time. Where, I mean, there was lines snaking out of that place, waiting to get in, people coming in, Rolls Royces who would have to wait in line because first come, first serve. It just didn't matter who you were. There was no table being blocked for you. And we had Indian cricket players waiting outside. They wanted to be there, but they had to wait their turn. So I think we stood by that for a long time, and that really became so much of the success story, and people dancing, uh, articulate staff, very cool kids walking around and having conversations. So it felt like this was your drawing room conversation. It didn't feel like you were at a restaurant or a pub or a bar. Free pool in the basement. I mean, who does that? Or who did that? Now everyone does it, but it was free. Everyone could just play. No one had to pay anything.
Hmm.
Became ridiculously profitable. Let's just say that as a business model, it became so ridiculously successful that suddenly, the investors like open 5,000 of these, there should be one in every back alley. But that's for another story. That entire paradigm works. But it was very successful. It was a very, very successful format.
I mean, yeah, when you're doing this kind of attention to detail and getting the stuff going, it's not exactly something that you can easily translate into a multi-city kind of franchise and all that, right?
It wasn't a franchise.
No, I'm saying what the investor is saying about the 5,000 one in every back alley kind of thing. It wouldn't be the same if you did that, right?
It never is. It never is. And I think that's why even now, I mean, Toast and Tonic has been on Wood Street for 7 years, but you can sit down in an auto in Bangalore and say, "Take me to Monkey Bar," and they'll drop you on Wood Street. So that only happens once in a way. And the Delhi Monkey and the Bombay Monkey were also very successful. Calcutta Monkey Bar still continues to be one of the most successful monkey bars that we have, because we created a structure of scale which is very interesting. Each time we would open a new unit, we would move 40 to 45% of our team over there and hire new ones. So there was never a gap really, because the anchors were still there, and some of the best would move in and carry that DNA into those spaces. So there's never compromise. Delhi had not, I mean, to tell Delhi walas that you have to share a table, boss, is is ballsy, and we pulled it off. And I remember in one of the early days, I used to be a fly on the wall, and there were like 9,000 people trying to cram into that place. It had already established its bona fides, so everyone wanted to be there. And I was having a cigarette outside because it's this last shape pyramid which nobody wanted to touch. It was a nightmare of a project. But somehow we pulled it off. And I was standing outside, and there must have been like 200, 300 people waiting outside to get in. And these two girls came down in their, little black dresses and very high heels. And she turned around, she's like, "Dekhna, ek hafte mein band ho jayega. Zyada se zyada ek saal chalega, usse zyada nahi hai." Here we are, completing 10 years of it and still going strong. So it's, I think, because we didn't, for the longest time, digress too much from what was said. Of course, the market became very busy. Lots and lots of other new products in a similar space opened. And like I've always said, it becomes a race down to the bottom. MRP pricing, undercutting all kinds of costs. I mean, it's a win for the consumer. I don't deny it. It's a great win for the customer. But it's an untenable, it's an unwinnable exercise. So you're either washing somebody's money or you're burning somebody's money, honestly. Where that is making business sense is beyond me. And I've been in this business long enough to sort of understand it. So yeah, I mean, how do you compete with that? You see this play out in the online space. You see it play out, if you can't have a scenario where everyone wants to be a monopolist. No one's going to win. And we just saw a lot of that. So did that take its toll? Of course it did. It became impossible to compete after a point of time. So I said, don't compete. Just stick to your guns and people will come back. They may not come for 6 months because there's some new shiny thing that's opened up, but 6 months later they'll come back, and they did. And I think that's really where I give a lot of credit to our teams, to our loyalists in the fact that they remain loyal to these brands, and that's really what kept them afloat, and which keeps them afloat, and is testament to the fact that the teams have understood that this heavy discounting and MRP pricing is not always going to work. Have some of our brands done it? Sure, they have, but let me also tell you that nothing good has come of it.
I want to come back to this, but I also want to ask you before that about the cheese, which was how many years now? 4 years ago, you were telling me about that?
4 years ago, yes.
Yeah. So what prompted that?
A random conversation over a lunch. I don't really go out very much. Lunch invitations especially, but a very dear client who insisted that I come because her mother cooked something. So I did, and very close to work. And there was 2 other people at the table, both of whom I knew, and I was just having a conversation about cheese and cheese making, and like how it's impossible to find quality cheese in India, and when you do find quality cheese, it's extremely expensive. And I've always wanted to have a little cheese set up. I've been speaking to a consultant. Maybe I'll take a little garage near Olive and do something. And then this lady perked up and said, well, I have a plot of land which maybe you could see. Well, I'm very interested in this as well. I said, okay, when can I see it? She's like, come tomorrow and see it. So I went the next day and I saw this, fairly central location. This barren piece of land which looked like it had been bombed out in the Second World War because half the building was missing. It was like torn, and I said, this is perfect. So we'll do it here, overgrown, and clean it up. And then another partner, Pooja, she joined in and said, I also want to be part of this. And I pitched it to the company. I said, if you want to be part of owning the supply chain, which for me is, a very big motivator, is I've always wanted to be the person who can actually have control over the entire supply chain in many ways, because then I don't have to break my head over 500 things. I can't do everything, but I can definitely do a lot of it. And so then the journey began, and Begum Victoria was a name I came up with because both the ladies were called Begums by the husband, and we were on Victoria Road. So I said, this is just a natural fit. And we got some good branding going, and we had a great consultant. And when we started with one tiny little vat and one small room and one tiny little cave, practically a little fridge. And we have 5 giant caves now and a huge production facility, which is about to grow at least 3x again, because we are sitting on a very good problem where our demand is much greater than our supply capability. But again, it's a brand that continues to stay boutique and making an incredible range of products and growing strength to strength. I think no rush to scale up. So as we completely ace one process, and the proof of concept is always in the sales and the customers. Bombay Canteen right now carries Begum's Brie, her appetizer, which is really nice, and they've acknowledged its origin. So we've not even touched B2B. We've not really looked at other cities. We largely focused on B2C, which is direct to consumer, only through our Instagram. So there's just so many things which are so micro in this that if we just tried to scale up a little, we'd be faced with greater problems. We just wouldn't have supply capabilities. So yeah, it's a brand that's now become fairly cult over the last 4 years, and hopefully becomes bigger over the next 4.
So we've touched on this in different kinds of ways as we've talked, but the whole thing, specifically being a chef is one thing, being an entrepreneur, running a restaurant as a business, not just thinking about the food part, it's complicated. Any kind, whether it's, hole in the wall, small restaurant, or a fine dining, large experience, or, whatever in a 5-star hotel. How did you pick up that part of it? That mindset, what goes into that? You talked about supply chains, you talked about staff training, you talked about this very interesting thing just now, the way that you move 40% of your staff there. So you had that level of continuity, training, DNA, all of that. That's a pretty interesting business move, I thought. And where did that come from? Where did you learn? How did you pick that kind of stuff up?
It's common sense, man. I mean, much of the business is common sense, and it's remarkable how many lack it. Uh, and
It's not
no,
common, is what I'm saying. Some of this stuff, that's what.
also this constant overstructuring of everything, delegation to 500 people. I mean, you're essentially shirking responsibility. I'm always somebody who's led by example, and I mean, and I still, this is the gauntlet. Now, of course, everything is going to be in past tense, but I mean, post pandemic, etc. I was one of the main line cooks, pushing out all the orders, doing all the prep, making sure everything's in place. Sure, big shot chef, owner of many restaurants, but you got to, if you don't lead by example, it's impossible to get your teams to be able to work with the same work ethics. And that's really what creates a great concise format, which usually works as a very profitable model, even on low revenue benchmarks. And low revenue benchmarks, I mean, I can go into the business side of this in a fair amount of detail, and it's an argument I've often had with some of the bigger boys in the business. And I like, I can turn the same profit as you can on, and you on a much larger scale, me on a much smaller scale, because I run a very different format. Everyone has to do something and do it as effectively as possible. So at a low revenue benchmark, I still turn the same profit as you do on a high revenue benchmark. Yeah, sure. Now you went into the valuation game and the P fund game and the top line drivers, etc. I said it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if you've got bottom lines, that's really what's going to matter. The other thing that you were able to do with lower revenue benchmarks is actually run better operations. When there's a very high revenue coming out from a space, let me tell you that something is not right. Means you're overcrowding it. There is always a bhasad. The drinks are not coming on time, or they're diluted, or they're very mediocre. But you can't really run that scale of operation that's built for a smaller operation and say that you're doing everything right. So there's always that trade-off. So what do? You make the music louder, right? You make more shots going out, because that's how you really bridge that gap. You add more French fries on the menu, French fries with truffle, French fries with peri-peri, French fries with Cajun dust, French fries with God knows what. But essentially, that's the fastest thing out through the window, or through the pass. All of this is essentially being done so that you can continue driving the top line on one side, overcrowding the restaurant on the other, not really focusing on, I mean, what is the core focus then? I spoke earlier about how I create organic and ad hoc products, but at least I know that if I'm making these 20 things, I'm making them well and they need to go out consistently. Here, if you see the menu mixes, it'll blow your mind. It really will. You'll see the number one selling dish is French fries. And you got a fine dining restaurant. Go fucking drown in a cosmopolitan. I mean, that's ridiculous. But that's it. That's the race down to the bottom. Welcome to Indian Restauranting 101.
So how was it like these last year and a half, this whole pandemic scene? How did you and the industry, how have you been weathering this? What's been happening?
Well, it's tough. And it's been tough at the expense of our people, largely. Who most companies who realize that, I mean, essentially, who are working on debt financing and PE funding, etc. It's impossible to support them when they need it the most because of this reckless expansion that everyone was on. And why are they on this reckless expansion? You need to ask that question, because not very many people from the industry are going to throw truth bombs. And when I'm sitting outside of it, I can. Not that I didn't in the past. It's essentially wealth generation for a handful of people and nothing else. It's greed. There's no bona fide intent over here of creating great legacy brands, honestly. And it's sad to see that. I mean, and I'm talking about from a broad spectrum view. So what happens when a scenario like a pandemic arrives? There's no way to bail out anybody, right? Because you're already sitting on a huge amount of liability. Everything is done through debt financing. Everything is done through rolling debt. You have no reserves. And when you have no reserves, how do you pay salaries? When you know everything is completely come to a grinding halt. Um, and that has created a huge correction in the market at many levels, in terms of way staff approach work, in terms of um, how how many people want to come back into the workforce actually. And this is something you read about every day. How landlords approach things, but also how, very importantly, uh, how the modeling of that business needs to be finally. So everyone's now started cutting costs hugely, essentially to make sure that if anything like this ever comes to pass again, you need to have some level of indemnification. But you can see the moment the first unlock happened, from the euphoric response that revenge dining and all these other, terms that have been, everyone's really basically gone back to square one. It's amazing how we don't learn from our mistakes. And I've said this several times, and everyone's like, "Oh, the industry is on the upswing and this and that." I said, "Yeah, of course it is. You want to pack the place in like sardines again? It's going to be on the upswing." So what have you learned? Yeah, but they'll be on some Zoom panel talking about how we're taking all the measures to make sure that everyone's completely protected and every safety protocol is in place. And we even have a large, tin can hanging on top, which supposedly throws out some kind of tantric waves that kills COVID, which was another scam that came out. It's unbelievable. It really is unbelievable what all goes on. So yeah, I mean, going back to that root question, it's largely a common sense driven. Yeah, it's if you really want to run a good place, you can, and do it profitably, and do it well. But when that intent doesn't exist, then don't expect it to show up. And don't lament over how we don't have good restaurants in Bombay and Bangalore and Delhi or whatever. Because I'll tell you who's making the money. The owner's making the money, the landlord's making the money. Because these real estate prices are preposterous. They make no sense whatsoever. They are first world prices first world rents on third world prices. It's not sustainable. And this madness that happens, this overcrowding and selling more liquor and more, shots and more French fries, is principally so that you can pay the landlord first and then still make a neat enough profit to sort of, break even very, very quickly.
A couple of other things that I did want to talk about, but I'm just also reminding those of you in the audience, if you have questions, you can just put them in the chat anytime. And I'll come to them one by one. You can put them in the Q&A box preferably, so it's easier to find. Not that the chat is very active at this point, but happy to listen. But Manu, the thing that you wrote for us about when I was with ForbesLife, and we talked about local ingredients and the importance of that, of sourcing locally. Do you want to just get into that a bit? Because a lot of this fine dining experience that we hear about is this has come from there and that has come from there, and something from Chile and Norwegian this and something from wherever. But the whole thing, and when you're talking about fine dining, a lot of it is about you need a certain quality, and you're not going to say of beef, and you're not going to get that beef quality, or other in some parts of this country, you're not going to get beef at all, but you're not going to get that beef quality in, say, a certain area, so you import it. But you have advocated the whole thing of looking local, sourcing ingredients local. How does that work in the fine dining scenario? Have you made it work?
I have nothing against importing stuff. It's impossible to run a fine dine unless you're being able to create a level of experience which is differentiated at many levels, sourcing included. I do love local product for many reasons. A is because I think the biodiversity that is accessible to us is remarkable. And folding that into the menus, folding that into, that should be a natural process. Importing stuff and putting this, like I said, I have nothing against that, because that's really where you create the differentiated experience. And, I can't make a Parma ham pizza with a local Parma ham ever. It'll still have to come from Italy. And that's really the experience that people are willing to pay for or enjoy, because it is very good. I still can't, you get some Indian version of Parmesan, but it's not happening. You still need to get, now you can't even get Parmesan into the country, so I have to get Grana Padano because that has animal rennet in it. So I think a balanced approach is always a good one, where you're doing enough and working with local farmers, local produce, local biodiversity, and still being able to bring in interesting, exciting things from different parts of the world, which make that menu, all the more endearing. So I'm not a militant proponent of, eat within 1 kilometer radius and all that. It's impossible. You'll never be able to create, long, when I say sustainable experiences, I'm not talking about from a sustainability point of view. I'm talking about a sustainable customer engagement. It becomes difficult. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
And sort of, yeah, I get it. I know what you're talking about. I was just interested in how you reach that balance when you're within that fine dining experience, exactly the kind of examples that you quoted. If you're not getting a certain quality, then what do you do? Right? But we'll come back on this, because I do want to let audience have questions. And what Ujjwal is asking was what I was going to get to as well. A couple of months ago, you said hanging up the apron, right? You're walking away from a lot of the stuff that you created, and you're chilling. You're figuring. I mean, why walk away in the first place? Before we get to Ujjwal's question on what's next, because yes, we will ask that question, but why walk away?
I've done it long enough. So I've done it long enough. I thought about it a few times in the past, and I was like, why am I doing it really? What is the end goal on this? And the more I saw the sort of structures and the constraints that we were working under, the more I saw how funding works, how dilutions work, how wealth generation actually works. And I was like, at the end of a long career, mercifully, my long career started at an early age, so at least I'm not at a disadvantage in that sense. But if at the end of a long career and after investing all my life saving, I'm going to walk away from this entire exercise with very little in hand, it's not really worth my while. Because I can be loyal, to a fault and for a very long time, but I'm not a martyr. I'm building value and businesses. I'm no martyr, and I refuse to be one. For what? On what cause am I doing this? I'm not giving my life up for the damn country, right? I'm doing it for someone's bank balance at the end of the day, and it makes no sense whatsoever. And I did not see any value generation happening. And for myself as a professional, or myself as a person. And that's when I said that I guess it's time for me to just do what I like doing. And I have that very FU approach to doing things anyway. I was like, no formulas, no models, but I make them work. But I'd rather do it with a clean conscience. And I'd rather do it when I have been able to bail the company out of its darkest hour. So I stuck around for another year. Actually, I kind of decided to do this last year, but I didn't. For the sake of my people also, because at least now they had a stable model. And that's why I was in the kitchen, sweating it out, making sure that there was great delivery. We were entertaining guests, we were doing amazing stuff all across. And that confidence was coming back and people were coming back and we were profitable again. And when we got to that level, I was like, okay, sayonara.
Mm-hmm. But with the later restaurants, you did have a slice of the action, right? I mean, with the later restaurants within the group, you did own a slice of those, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Between the two of us, we owned a fair amount of the company. It wasn't a small amount.
Hmm.
Okay, we walked away from that largely. I mean, and that's fine. The cable, and there's no acrimony over here. It was a conscious decision, and we understood this is probably the worst time to walk away. Uh, but then see, Peter, what's the trade-off? I'd have to be able to build that value and I have to do this for another 2 or 3 years. Um, it was possible, but why? Like I said, why did I need to do that? I was at a point where I really wanted to do remarkable new stuff, and I would not be able to do it with the constraints or the routines. Um, and the best thing is that I've never had till the very last day a moment where I slacked off. So I was completely dedicated, completely driven, completely on the ball till the very last day, and I think that's more than a lot of people are able to do when they've decided to move on. And still, involved and engaged in some level, and the customers who keep calling me, staff who keeps calling me, asking for help, etc. I'm more than happy to. But I would not have been able to do more fun, exciting things in the future that I planned to, and had I continued with the same sort of structure.
Mm-hmm. I'll take this question from Vikas about your approach to. Vikas T asks, can you tell us a bit about your approach around balancing familiar menu items with new items? Did you need to fall back to introducing more familiar dishes at any of your ventures to avoid feeling too rebellious or contrarian?
I answered that in the beginning, right, with that whole being ahead of the curve, etc., and then introducing a certain level of comfort. Look, I think again, years and experience have taught me that. I mean, what are the odds? So if I have to do, and I always give this terrible example because this is an example which kind of fits the bit. If I have to do a well-cooked pasta, swimming in white sauce, no mushroom, no broccoli, add chicken, add chili, whatever, it's fine. I'm not making 500 portions a week. I may be 1 or 2 portions a month. For 2 people who come into the restaurant who do not necessarily know like different kinds of pasta, and this is what they like. Does it make me compromise what I do? No, absolutely not. Does it make those 2 customers happy? Absolutely, yes. Would they come back again with a bunch of friends? Possibly. So I've reached that point where I've stopped throwing the shit fit in the tantrum, and I just give it. It doesn't matter. And there will be cooks who will be, the newer, younger generation. How can I do this? This completely, my career has been destroyed because I made a pasta. I was like, oh, please shut the fuck up and just make it and send it out, because you're still doing what you're doing. Focus on doing that right, as opposed to crying over one dish that you had to send out. That doesn't bring the restaurant operations to a grinding halt. People are still coming back for your fancy taco with the 20 garnishes. So just do it. And I think I've reached that kind of zen, and I've also been able to, I think, menu engineer in a way that there's enough and more excitement for a lot of people on that menu. They don't have to order the penny and white sauce. So take it to a point where you become that restaurant rather than the internal conflict that it always causes. Does that answer your question?
Vikas, does that answer your question? I hope it does. But Manu, to go back to what Ujjwal was asking and what I was asking you earlier before we opened up the conversation, what's on your mind now? What happens next for Chef Chandra?
What happens next? That's a very good question. That's a $1 million question right now, a multi-million-dollar question. Well, I was telling Peter before all of you came on, I, of course, have a fair amount of plans, things that I've been thinking about, working on. Will I be in restaurants again? Of course I will. Restaurants are my first love, and they will continue to be, and I will continue to create great products, hopefully, that all of you can come and when and where or how that happens is kind of remains to be seen, but will probably be Bangalore-based to begin with. But there are also other things that I've kind of been, dabbling in. As somebody asked in the Q&A about my association with Serendipity Arts Festival, who I worked with very closely for a long time, and I continue to at a slightly more long-term and hands-on level now, I think, because they also have great plans, and they wanted me to be part of that journey in more meaningful ways. So that's something I'm going to continue and create interesting sort of experiences, create interesting intellectual property for them. I'm also now part of, which I'm sure there's enough information leaks happening here and there. Something in the whole plant-based space, which I think is interesting, definitely has some level of future. There will be ups and downs, and there will be corrections, but it's a calculated, I think, risk. But I definitely think that those sort of noises and spaces that a chef should be in right now, if you are somewhat relevant. The cheese, of course, is doing well. I'm also working with the spirits company. So lots of stuff happening. And there will be more stuff happening, obviously, in the restaurant space. So I'm, you're going to keep hearing about it as and when it comes about. But for me to give you a definitive answer saying that I'll be opening a restaurant in 2 months' time, no, I would not be. I would have happily made that announcement early on. Have I done some level of hiring? Yes, at a core level, people who I can right now bounce off ideas with and have discussions with. It's difficult to do it alone. And so I think that's a work in progress. And where that goes, hopefully you'll find out sooner than later. Was there a more specific question on the serendipity on the Q&A bit? I closed that. Let me see.
Yeah, it's there. In fact, I was on watching a couple of panels last week, which was precisely about this kind of thing, which is the role of food in festivals. And British Council and friends of mine were organizing this company called ArtX, which I consult for, who did this set of conversations on food in festivals, which was fascinating to listen to the way that you go about celebrating food, in other words. So Niharika's question is, was intrigued about the platform, Serendipity Arts Festival, and that you had created there on indigenous cultures and cuisines. Are you still associated with it, which you did partly answer just now? But would you want to riff a bit more on that indigenous cultures and cuisines bit?
There was one part of one of the activations in Niharika. It wasn't really a sum total of the whole. There was a lot happening in the food space at Serendipity. This is when I was an active curator. I was an active curator for 2 years. I was the founding curator for the festival. And the idea was to also change the curators every 2 years or so. So that happened for the next 2 years. I think Rahul was, Akirkar was the curator for the next 2. But for my stint, I'd done some very cool stuff, actually, something around food and theater in 2 very different forms. One was called Memory Recipe, which ironically, I was speaking to the spirits people this morning about how we got a bunch of complete strangers to walk into a dark tent and sit around a table, and just through using sound and smell, made them recollect a very strong food memory from childhood, and with very familiar smell cues and sound cues, which were altered, grandmother speaking in Hindi, in Punjabi, in Tamil, in Telugu, somebody cooing, the sound of chopping, the sound of cutting. So essentially rekindling, and this, the memory of smell is a very, very strong one. It kind of triggers very strong memories. And after the end of that performance, everyone was given a piece of paper, and there were theater actors moving around the space, being the grandmother. You couldn't see them because it was a dark room, but you feel the brush against it, suddenly somebody touching your head. And it was remarkable, the memories it triggered in everyone. And depending on which region of the country they were from, there was a very strong food association with those smells. It was a fantastic project, and it got picked up and it traveled the globe and stuff also. Then I did another one with the same theater company where it was political satire, using street food as a metaphor. And so a little story about the country through its street foods with these art, these performers and mukotas standing behind the street food stall and actually making food. So not only would people who were part of this performance get to eat a puchka or a litti chokha or a jhal muri or whatever, but move through those regions and understand the problems with the country and politics in general. It was also very nicely put together production. Oh, there was lots of other stuff we did actually. If we go on, there was these people who came in from Ireland who made crazy stuff they did. Yeah, they made you lie down in the grass out in near the Mandovi River and showed you how butterflies would basically come and sit on your eyes to drink your tears, and that's one of the first things that get attracted. Crazy stuff, cover crop cuisine, foraging out in Goa. It also had some of the highest traction, incidentally, an arts festival where the food vertical tended to get more footfalls than the art. And I said that was bound to happen. It always happens, but at least we're engaging them in very interesting ways. There was wine appreciation, chocolate appreciation, cheese appreciation. All that also happened. A more deep dive in how you are able to discern differences, nuances. So, yeah, I think it was a great service to Goa, that festival was. And I'm sure.
Very much so. I mean, a lot of festivals will tend to look at food as being, we dump a food court, people have to eat, and you put in your standard stuff. But look at the food as being part of the creative thinking, the curatorial experience, the curatorial thinking and the creative experience of it was lovely.
I ended up going to Taiwan because of that, because the Taiwanese government invited me because they were fascinated that food had become part of an arts festival that was specific interest to them. So I went for this crazy art festival in Taiwan, in a crazy country with crazy people, but fascinating and amazing food. And I did, when I spoke about it at the inaugural, and I also did a demonstration about Kayast cuisine, which I did on the backdrop of Umrao Jan playing, and gorgeous Rekha, which everyone was smitten by, and the dances, and as I was making koftas and mutti kebab, as we call them at home. But yeah, I mean, a lot of interesting stuff around food and art from serendipity and experiences thereof. But like I said earlier, guys, already we've run into 2 hours and 17 years of just Bangalore-based experiences or India-based experience, very difficult to distill into a small conversation across so many geographies. So yeah, if you have specific questions, please shoot.
Okay, we have Vikas with another question. I was curious about your approach to education when it comes to serving new and unfamiliar food. Do you explain it upfront, or do you let the audience discover it, or is it some mix of the two?
Well, I definitely think it's a mix of the two, and we're in. Now you just pull out your phone and you Google everything. So I think people figure it out, and I think that laziness is quite apparent in the way a lot of people approach their menus also. Like people will just figure it out, put random terms, or I don't think we develop that level of complexity in the menu any which way that would require a whole lot of explanation. And I think the products are such. I've also been very clear on how I write my menus. And I've written my menus myself for the most part, and also made sure that they're fairly self-explanatory. And that is, sadly, the reason I do that is so that, service staff, if we're at a situation where we don't have the best communicators, there's no requirement for communication because the menu is doing all the speaking. It's fairly clear. If there are very specific questions on whether that dish has something or does not have something, that invariably is a question that comes back to the kitchen anyway, unless you have incredibly good staff. It happened recently. I went to a very good restaurant, asked for something, and said that I said, there's three of us, but it's only half a portion. They say, no, it's a full portion. I said, no, it's half a portion. They said, no, it's a full portion. I said, don't tell me. I know it's a half a portion. The bloody picture shows it's a half a portion. He's like, okay, let me check with the kitchen. And he comes back. He's like, you're right, it's half a portion. I said, I know I'm right. The picture is half a portion. So how can it suddenly become a full portion? So that sort of thing happens. And that's why it's sometimes good to have a very clearly written menu. So I like doing that. And once it's there, I don't think a lot of explanation is really required. Not anymore, at least.
This thing of, I mean, Indians, want to set their food a certain way, depending on where, of course, it's a wide generalization, but considering how varied cuisine is in the country. But, the thing of like wanting it spiced up, things like that. Do you get that kind of stuff happen?
Every day.
Hmm?
Every
And
day. I mean, listen, we like chatpata food, and let's not whitewash the fact that some of the most successful restaurants in the country are successful because they do chatpata food, and there's nothing wrong with it. I own up to it, admit it, and saying, yes, we love chatpata, we love serving it, we love eating it, and that's really the success mantra. And why change it? I mean, we don't like subtlety. We don't like subtlety. If we like subtlety in something, we'll appreciate it. But we like bold, punchy flavors, and that's really what's going to work. So, I mean, I can't sit on some kind of, culinary high horse and saying that you're going to have poached fish with 3 drops of extra virgin olive oil and that's going to rock your boat. No. You're going to pull out the oregano and the chili flake and probably douse some butter on it also because we like it. And it's fine. So having requests for things spiced up is never going to go away. You just make it spicy, so you don't have to ask for it spicy.
Fair. Right. I've just asked if she wants to come and join in the conversation as well. But we have time for some more questions. We're at about the 2-hour mark right now, which is what we're aiming for. But we will go on for as long as Manu, after his 20 whiskey tasting today, and you folks are willing to hang on.
I'm already hungover from it. It was early in the afternoon. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, Manu spent part of his day tasting 20 whiskeys, 20 different labels in this time. So, we need to cut him some slack if he needs to get some sleep at some point after that. But yeah, Keshi, feel free to come in, and Janvi, if you want to talk as well. Janvi Falke is there. Sisi. Anyone in the attendees that you think you'd like to bring in as well, Manu?
Hi, Kishi.
Hi.
You guys know each other from the CIA, right? Your time there overlapped a bit.
I relate to so many things you just said for CIA being so expensive, and I don't know how people can afford it. I took 10 years to pay that money. So it is really, really expensive. But Manu, so nice to see you.
Likewise.
So nice to see you smiling.
I know. This is what
The
happens.
whiskeys, I bet.
Yeah, it's one of this reputation you have for being this guy who's, with the temper, with the, as Kishi said, smiling. Like, Manu's smiling, not scowling over a cigarette.
I only smile on Zoom.
I've never seen him sulking or anything. I've always seen him as a happy person. I mean, whatever little I've seen of him. But happily drinking, so Bangalore. But that's about it. I've not seen him sulking so far. Except I just read everywhere. He doesn't smile. But he's smiling, though, obviously. It's the whiskeys. Get into the whiskey business, please.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But there's so many things. I have a question. So, and it's something I've faced through, like the whole beginning from coming from the US, the rolling of the R's and all that. And I was in fact telling Peter about it last time that, I went to a take and I was like, can I get some tequila? And they were like, hamare paas Simran off hai, chahiye. So here's what I want to know. And I don't know how, initially, how when you come back from the US and you generally have your own perceptions of things from, let's say, like I would only like dark chocolate. And then I had to sort of educate everyone that, listen, Cadbury's is not chocolate. It's nostalgia mostly. It's not chocolate. But it took me over 2 years for people to sort of accept the fact that, and by the time obviously people were learning, traveling was happening, that 70% can be good. And obviously things have changed now. It's a decade, of trying and practicing, and there's still people who still love the 40% and milk chocolate and stuff. I want to know, how did you deal with all this? Like when it happened, and and obviously things are different then, like you learned pasta in a specific way, and then you want to come back here and they want to put chili sauce and the green sauce on it. How did you deal with it?
I deal with it. I deal with it. See, the thing
Like, did
is,
you ever say no to a customer and say, sorry, I cannot make this for you?
depends on my mood, which is usually off, so it was mostly no. No, I mean, I think when they were pushing their luck too much, then I would put my foot down. If it's small adjustments which are not really hurting the food or what we do in any substantial way, then it's fine. So it's an innocuous request. I'm okay with it. If you want me to reinvent the bloody wheel for you, in the middle of a busy service, I'm not going to do that. That's not great service. That's massive compromises. So when I said earlier that I've reached Zen to a point, I mean, which is okay. That's feasible. You bend the model only so far. From the education point of view, I said, look, like the early days, I lucked out with the Goras. So if I did not have all these well-heeled CXO, CEO, CFO Goras from all these multinationals who are essentially populating the restaurant on an ongoing basis, I would have been driven crazy because I would not have anything to sell them. Right. And at this point, I was throwing everything at them, great baby lobster frito, foie gras, this 8 little pigs or 7 little pigs I was talking about, tasting menus, stuff that was happening internationally, and I had a client base ready for it.
Right.
I think that definitely helped ease that rite of passage, and also kind of slowly opened the doors to everybody else in Bangalore, who then started saying that, hey, this is not so bad after all, so let's try it. So I would definitely say that I probably lucked out a little, but I can understand, because I still face that, across the board as well, where people just are unwilling to understand that there is something better available. And as operators, our job is to kind of bring better stuff to the fore. But largely, I also understand that they're just completely unwilling to do it. And the chocolate example, right? 70% compound, for example. I mean, there's just one compound. They're willing to pay, XYZ for it, then, knock yourself out, eat the compound. It's, I just save myself a buttload of money because you as a client insisted on it. I would rather that you eat chocolate. Who's that? Okay, sorry, I thought there was a question. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it is always going to be difficult. But remember that, Kishi, for you and me, it was a lot harder. We came in a time where both availability, access, and choice were very limited. And I keep saying that I sound like an old hag when I say to, all the sort of new kids who are joining the workforce, I say, you guys have it very easy.
True, I agree. I mean, just finding good vanilla was a nightmare then.
So here you have everything. You have access to everything, and you have access to stuff beyond what you know.
Yeah, I mean, I had no YouTube in my days. I had no access to, yes, Google was there and all that, but I don't know if I ever looked for definitions there. It's what the teachers taught you at school, your research, your practice. So, yeah. Manu, I want the vegetarian burger back. Please bring it back. It's the nicest thing. There are no good burgers in Delhi.
How do I bring it back?
I don't know. You bring it back somehow. I don't know. Do some magic. Make it in. Okay, feed me when you come to Delhi. How about that? I get you your Rajma Chawal and you feed the burger.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in this, the entire meat substitute stuff. In fact, one of the conversations I've got lined up in January is with someone who's doing work on this. And we'll be talking about all the good work that's happening in India, both in the lab-grown meat as well as the plant-based meat substitutes. And there's a hell of a lot. I attended a conference a couple of weeks back on this subject. Interesting stuff. Your veg burger and everything, the vegetarian options. There's a great amount of work happening on that. Right?
There is lots.
What
it's only better. As in the products are going to get better, and we're going to peak very soon. So I think we're very, very, very close to that peak. and it's already so real. So, I mean, how much more real can you make it? I mean, it can't walk out of your plate saying moo. So it's as close as it gets.
A question from Sunalini, who was, you could come on and ask this yourself and join the conversation if you want to, but I'll ask this one for you now. What's your opinion on food journalism in India and food bloggers?
Thanks for bringing this up. And you bring it right at the end. You should have brought it up when I was all charged up in the beginning. I would have got a glass of wine for this also and some popcorn on the side. Well, it was this. Let's not, sugarcoat it. It was terrible for the most part, and for many years, and it was embarrassing, honestly, for people who were, dangling their, credentials as food journalists. They weren't. There were people who'd just been given the extra, unwanted task of free meal and writing about food. And the garbage that was produced, I mean, really, there should be tomes written to that also. But you had no choice, you dealt with it. And sure, I mean, as a serving chef, then I couldn't really say very much. And I can see Radhika over there who never let me say anything. I can say whatever the fuck I want. But it was true for the most part. And the saddest part, honestly, was that so many of them were so busy with their own images that they forget what they were supposed to write about. And that was celebrating great food in great restaurants, not yourself. I mean, your ego and image were not what were on display over here. Not unless you were like a Jay Rayner, who's a brilliant, food writer, or so many of them, Ruth Reichel. When they write about food, it's like poetry. I mean, you can read books written by them over and over again because they're so well written. A lot of that didn't exist. In the early days, I'd put together a tasting menu and somebody would come up and saying, I don't eat 90% of what you made. I'm allergic to everything. I said, which desk do you work on? They said, the crime desk. I said, yeah, I mean, sure. What the hell are you doing here? Reviewing a restaurant. They're like, oh, we didn't have any full-time writer. So, I mean, imagine having to go through so much of that constantly. Sure, it's part of the struggle, but that's really what it stood for. It was, and then everything became monetizable. Then, you would pay for a review or a nice review or pay for, so that you didn't get a bad review. But what did reviews really do, or what do they do anymore is the question before, the giants on the online space came about and everybody with a keyboard became a food critic. I am very proud to say to the 13, 14 attendees over here that I have not read a Zomato review in the last 5 years. I refuse to open it and read it. I do not need that negativity in my life or positivity in my life. I'm okay being blissfully unaware. The restaurant is full. The regulars are coming back. The cash tills are clicking. The company is making money. The awards are streaming in. The fuck do I need to, read that review for? It's completely unnecessary, especially beyond the point. If something really bad goes down at the restaurant, there are ways of actually making amends on the spot. And that's what good restaurants and service are about. It's not about your, writing chops after 2 whiskeys in the middle of the night saying, what a disaster of an experience I had over there. You just needed to call the waiter and ask him to switch the dish over and it would have been perfectly good. So, I mean, come on. And I think a lot of food writing in India largely reflected that. I'm glad to now see a younger set, very, very focused on really interesting issues. So it may not be restaurant writing so much, but it'd be amazing writing about food or, allied genre. And those are lovely. And I really do enjoy reading a lot of those. And I really do enjoy, reading a lot of the in-depth sort of analysis, pieces that have been sanctioned by great online platforms. And so I see a lot more game in that. I think restaurant writing, for the most part, it's dead in the water. There's not going to be very much that's going to be exciting in that space for a long time. There's just going to be 1 or 2 voices. And yeah, I mean, that'll be the sum total of the whole.
So who are the voices that you like? That you've read over the years, who's not necessarily, Sunilini asked that question as well, and that was going to be my next question too, which is, what is the food writing in India? And I don't mean, reviews one part of it broadly.
I'd split this in 2 things. There's food writing, there's restaurant writing.
Okay. Yeah, exactly.
So in the West classically, where of course this is it's very, very venerated, etc. The restaurant writers are god status because I mean they are essentially New York Times bureau chief for Rome, who has now become a food critic, right? So their writing chops and the writing credentials are phenomenal. Their investigative journalism credentials are phenomenal. They have Pulitzer prizes, and now they have taken on the food desk, which is a full-time job, mind you, maybe folded in with a couple of op-eds. That's a joy to read because it's a fair analysis. It happens after multiple visits. It's not something that's fluffed over. And that really drives a lot of people to do better work and be better versions of themselves. And that's so important. So restaurant writing is a different ballgame. And there isn't very much that happens in that space, honestly. I mean, you have trend pieces now, 15, 16 products like scrunched together in 2 sentences. What is anyone going to glean out of that, honestly? Nothing. So what are they going to rely on? They're going to rely on Google reviews and online reviews and Zomato reviews. So if anything, food writing has dug its own grave for all practical purposes. And that's really what customers have to go on. They have social media to rely on entirely. Now food writing is trying to catch up with the social media space, which is even more interesting. So you're trying to catch your own tail in some ways. Food writing, on the other hand, is really where I'm seeing a lot of promise. And I'm seeing that there is some remarkable talent. There's some very good writers. They're extremely articulate. The structure of their writing is a joy to read. They're doing a deep dive, into history, into culture, into the sciences of food across many platforms. You were asking me if there's any food writers at all that I have respect for. I have respect for all writers. I'm just saying what went wrong. And writing is not an easy thing, and there's only a handful of people who can actually pull it off really, really well. And you know that, right? Any writer who pulls it off really well becomes a bestseller as somebody you keep reading. I mean, of course, Veer has a very loud voice because of his reach, nationally and across borders. So he's very widely read, and he speaks his mind very often, and that makes a lot of people very scared also. But I can't really think of very many people who do. Chuchun, who's an old family friend, Rahul Verma is one of the first people who started documenting street food well before it became a Delhi-based guy, but obviously not part of the larger publication, and therefore you don't hear that name very often, but also very consistent in documenting great things. I mean, there's several others, but I think food writing is a very different genre to restaurant writing, and I don't think they should be mixed up that much. But there are, he's the Hindu writer, Tushun is, yeah. And I mean, read books like, by people like Lizzie Collingham, who's written a book called The Hungry Empire, which I was recommending to someone today only. And look at the depth of research and how beautifully that book has been put together, and how it completely makes you challenge your notions of food, of the word that I hate very much, authenticity, and many, many other things. But that's brilliant food writing. It makes you question yourself. Jonathan Safran for eating animals. It literally made me want to go vegetarian. Completely, I am largely vegetarian, but I just wanted to be completely vegetarian after reading that book, because that's powerful food writing, and there's a lot of really great authors out there, both India and abroad. So yeah, I wouldn't mix that with. But I really wish that mainlines carried it. The ones that survive in more substantial ways, even if it's online. That would be interesting.
I'm seeing some interesting food writing, making that distinction, not the restaurant reviewing thing, which is definitely a different kind of space, but that using that looks at food beyond that immediate meal. I see Whetstone doing a lot of good stuff. I see a lot of interesting stories on the Goya Journal as well. The platforms that are doing this kind of conversation, the great stuff on food forums where people are just writing for free and sharing knowledge, expertise of that kind. I see a lot of it happening on a regular basis with the recipe group I run. where people are just very generous with talking about where their food comes from and the traditions and what they mean, all of
No,
that.
my dad's part of a whole bunch of them, and I'm mostly off Facebook, but he's very, very deeply involved, and he really goes deep into the history and, great rationale on why a lot of cuisine, which, a lot of the kids these days just don't know. I mean, they have no context of it, and there's no one clearly to pass that knowledge down. So in some ways, some of these forums are great. In, early days, there used to be e-gullet. I don't know if you've heard of that, but when I was, e-gullet was fantastic. I used to read that all the time because there was just remarkable information over there. But also, I think, I don't know how much of a reading generation there is right now, but there's just phenomenal literature available around food, which is just it's so much more than just food. It's history, it's culture, and it's a deep sort of insight into your own identity in many ways, and off you are about it in so many cases. So I think I'm hoping, like you said, Whetstone, Goya, all these people will be able to make that proliferate more.
Epicurious was one of those platforms that I remember reading a lot on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Some very good stuff happening. Lots of writers that I have been following in the last few years as I started to look at, food beyond the reviews and things, looking at because there's so much you learn from those things. Yeah. Any other questions, folks? Those of you who are still here, and like if you want to ask your question on voice, just use the Zoom raise hands gesture, and I will turn on the thing for you to talk if you want. You don't have to turn on camera if you don't want to, but.
Okay, I have a question for Manu, since I'm working on side by side. Manu, what's your comfort food? Every chef has its comfort food. What's your comfort food? After making all this fancy food, what does Manu like to eat when he comes back home?
So you see, I mean, thing with is I don't really order out very much, and when you cook for one person, it's very difficult to cook in one person quantities. So I usually cook like once, but that sort of sees me through multiple meals. So, and I'm incredibly unfussy eater. I mean, just give me the same dal and chawal for the next 6 days, and I'm a happy trooper. I'm actually a very functional eater. I'm not hedonistic at all. I love
dal chawal. Dal chawal.
Dal chawal, rajma chawal, something. But I'm mostly a chawal eater. I'm not so much of a roti eater. And for years, since a kid, I've actually been, a lot of my North Indian employees find terribly bizarre. I mean, they can't eat if they don't have roti. I mean, they'll go on a bhook hartal. Don't give me roti and dal. Chawal also I'll eat very happily. I'll just have 2 bowls of dal and I'll be content.
Right.
I don't know where that came from, but that frugality in my approach to self-sustenance is, I don't know where it came from. It came from those endless hours working in the hotels, or when you just never had time for a meal, etc. But you forgot to eat actually sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's pretty common that you end up eating little chunks here and there, and you don't really eat a meal what you're serving it to.
So, I mean, for me, that really was, you eat meal or plus more of the time, and that one small meal a day at maybe 5 p.m. and then alcohol and chips maybe at the end or something like that, So it was always that. But I'm there's no real comfort food for me. Everything is comfort. If it's tasty and it's hot, I don't like cold food. Thing is, I would rather have my meal hot. I can't pull it out of the fridge and start eating it.
Question from Sonia George, who says, your experiences are fabulous and great stories, and you write beautifully. Any plans in that area in the future, writing?
I do like, I'll be honest, I do enjoy writing, but I honestly like writing stuff that people would probably not publish, because they are not soft pedaled, they're not fluff pieces, they're things that people don't want to hear very often. And this is not me trying to be a rebel without a cause. It's just that I think when you're writing, then write honestly. And that's the least that you can do for your, I'm not a fiction writer here. So if I'm writing op-ed pieces, etc., I'd rather do it in that in that sense, or if I'm doing good investigative pieces, it takes time, and there's not that many people who want to publish that, even though I have been chased by enough publishers saying, write a book. Like, which book do you want me to write? A recipe book? Yeah. Do I look like a recipe book person to you? I'm the last sort of recipe book person. Take that off the record. You never know. If I'm broke tomorrow, I might make recipe books. No, but I always wanted to write something which is interesting, and I'm not sure what. Honestly, I'm not sure what. I always wanted to do something which was more than just recipes. Recipes are interesting, but there's so many out there. There's millions and millions and millions online, and you can tap into them at any time. So anything I bring into the system is not really going to be new, unless I do something like, out there, completely fine dining, multi-component recipes and all that. But who's going to buy it? It'll be a great coffee table book for some offices, but it's not really going to be something, or maybe some culinary schools, but I don't foresee that being a great seller. So I think my predicament is really that I do like writing, but I'm not sure what to write. If that answers your question.
Fair. Same. I wind up with the same kind of dilemma myself. But I'll segue from that into what Avirit Golani is asking, and add on a bit for myself. Taking off from the writing part and what else you could do, have you considered doing like a show, videos? I mean, YouTube or whatever it is, television basically, to have as part of the way to look at it and getting that that knowledge out. And Avirit's specific question, which is, do you ever plan to have a culinary institute or anything in the stream of education?
Yeah, I'll answer your question about the television part first. So again, I had an interview a couple of days ago, and the same question was asked, and I was like, look, I am not averse to it. But this is who I am. Now you take it or you leave it. Again, like I said, I'm not a fiction writer. I am not an actor. I am a chef. This is what I do. If I'm articulate enough for your show, great. If I'm not, too bad. I can speak 2 languages fairly well, which is Hindi and English. That basically covers all your television shows. But if you want me to be the Saas Babu boy, I'm sorry, I can't do it. And if you want me to, again, do, a fluff version of myself for television, it's very difficult. I'm just so out of my skin in that I will have to be technically acting. I was a good actor when I was in school and college, but I did that because I was acting. I wasn't, it wasn't an extension of me in any way. So I think that's really been the impediment in saying yes. I mean, there's been stuff that's come along, stupid scripts that have been thrown at me, very unprofessional media agency companies, I have to say. I mean, they're rather uncouth. They don't even know how to communicate effectively. For them, it's like, you're the checklist of 10 people, call them and saying, can you do this, can you do that, can you do this, can you do that, brush it off. Sure, I'm sure showbiz works like that, but I mean, imagine if I did that to them in my restaurant, right? They'd shit themselves. So that puts me off a lot. I think the lack of professionalism generally in that space is not very endearing. And till such time that something great comes along where they want me for what I do or who I am, I'd rather wait for that. And if that's another 10 years, then sure.
No, I mean, why not say do your own show? I mean, these things have been decentralized. You don't need to have someone coming to you to make a show or make you an offer. You could do your own show and put it on Vimeo, YouTube, or whatever it is.
Yeah, so that whole YouTube thing, of course, I mean, like I said, there's the day I made my announcement, that's when really the phone calls started, right? To, do this and do that. So some Netflix type shows. When I say Netflix, OTT offers, and we'll produce it and sell it, and sponsors will back you, and then do a YouTube channel. Interesting one actually, with very good scripts. I like that, but then I was just weighing it against the amount of bandwidth I had. How much time can I actually devote to that versus potentially a lot of work that's going to be happening on the brick and mortar spaces. And the Educational Institute, I've always been fascinated by that. In fact, like I said, I probably went to one of the best, probably 2 of the best educational institutes, right? One from the culinary arts point of view, and one from the liberal arts point of view, from an Indian perspective. And I mean, I love it. And I think effective teaching takes people a very long way, and I've done that in so many ways with the people who work with me over the years, nurtured them. And as I said earlier in the conversation, that everything that I've learned from culinary school, I'm willing to offer you here on a platter and for free, so that you don't have to pay ridiculous amounts of money to go and do that over there. But doing a more structured format to it would be nice. Have there been conversations about it? Yes, there have. People have expressed interest. People who own the educational institution, more importantly, rather than the faculty, because those are the guys who really call the shots. So let's see. I mean, I think India is ready to have a large, very dedicated sort of course for this. There's some people doing remarkable work in this space and very successful also. A friend of mine, Vinesh, has Lavon, which does short courses on pastry education, always oversubscribed. I think they have to keep scaling up because they can never keep up with the number of people who are applying for that course. But I think a more robust, like a degree course, which has more meat and substance added to it, I think it's definitely time for something like that. A little more advanced. Baksha is doing great, IHM is doing great, but there's a lot more that can be done in that space, because the world of food, the universe of food, is so large and so evolved from where the curriculum stand today, that I think there's a huge amount of educational correction still needed.
There actually was a question I wanted to ask earlier about, and Kishi also is someone who did the route of going to the CIA. How do you rate culinary education in India now at the time when you went off to study? How has it changed? How is it changing? Is there space? How could it get better than it is already?
See, Peter, there's enough access. Look, everyone has a smartphone today. You know exactly what's going on everywhere in the world, and there's YouTube that teaches you things that reading may not. The only sort of thing that comes in the way is actual hands-on practice. And that can be made available easily if they decide, kids who want to be in this space decide to go and do apprenticeships in restaurants, which was the old way of stepping into kitchens. The European style especially, they start working in kitchens when they're 14 years old. The baker's apprentice is often 14 or 15 years old. And it's not looked on as child labor or anything. That's really the rite of passage to becoming a professional. So, yeah, I mean, I just think, some kind of correction in the way access is created for these people, because the knowledge already exists and the knowledge bank exists and the access to the knowledge bank exists for free. So just a little method to that madness is, can take this a long way. There's a startup idea for you, Kishi, a little lab where people can come and practice.
I don't know. My preferences in life have changed. I want a small place in the hills, grow my own food. I'm trying to grow everything in Delhi on a terrace. So I spend more time on my terrace these days. But this is not a question. This is an appreciation. I say this to many people, whoever I talk to. And I don't know how many times I've told you. Maybe once, long time back when we were at Monkey Bar, in fact. So I met so many chefs abroad in India. And I'm not one of those chefs who are out there and attending social events. But if there's one genuinely very intelligent chef, the first name I always say is Manu Chandra. Always. It's never changed. And it's never going to change. I think the reason being, one, I've always seen him, keep himself up to date. And I never want you to change for anyone. Be who you are. That's what I love about you. Yeah. So
let's say that.
One of the smartest, and I don't know what others think about you, but for me, you're one of the sweetest guy I know. And I met back in CIA, and I told Peter in the interview last time that, it made me feel really nice that unlike half the Indians who were sticking to Indians and not trying to do anything else, I saw Manu being with his friends and I was with my Firangi friends, because we wanted to learn more, perhaps. We wanted to pick up from them and not just stick to the same Diwali preparations every time, and perhaps pick up a occasion they celebrate, or, the breads they eat. So I always admired that about you. And I know that I will admire that for the rest of my life. I hold you in very high regard. I just probably don't say it as much. But since I have a panel and a forum to say so, you're the smartest and the sweetest guy, and a hot guy too. So honest appreciation.
Type that in the comment section also.
If I've had 20 whiskeys, then I will type all this, but I've said it out loud. He has the recording. We will please take a snippet and make a reel and put it on Instagram.
I will make the recordings available.
Yes, please. And then Manu can put it up. But no, genuinely, Manu, you have no idea how much fond I am of you. So.
And she's not just saying that here; she was saying that to me earlier as well.
Yes, I've often said it to people, and I say it out loud that there are not many intelligent chefs in India. They're very good, award-winning, doing great, and number ones and whatnot. But I don't come across intelligent chefs who I can actually talk beyond food, because it's nice with the plate and all. But the moment you start discussing something else, you just start thinking, "What are you doing?" Then I have like I was telling Peter, I have very few food related friends. My friends are of different backgrounds. They are my real friends. So there are very few people I admire in the industry, and you're one of them. So
actually, I'm going to say something kind of concluding now, but I will not be able to speak very much more, Peter, is that through my career, the one thing that I have not done, which is an interesting little snippet for the balance who are still here, is I have never gone to a table, ever, and asked them how the food was. That is not the conversation I strike up with any customer. The conversation I've always struck up about everything else under the sun but the food. Because the base assumption has to be that everything was good. And that is why you came back. Had it not been, you would have actually brought it up yourself. And that's really how I've developed all these sort of relationships and, long friendships over years with patrons who, have carried me on their shoulders as much as I have sort of, looked after them. And I think that's very important for a lot of future chefs. And I keep telling them the same thing over and over again. I say, stop obsessing about yourself, engage in meaningful conversation, but it's only going to come if you read and educate yourself a little. I mean, we actually have a Kangana Ranaut version of a chef also in the country these days, which I'm going to keep for the masala chat later, if we ever get to that.
See, we made him laugh, Peter. He's laughing. So all those who crib and say he doesn't laugh, look at this. Please put this up.
That's the type of sort of Zoom call you do with whiskey in your hand, not after.
Well, I didn't say you couldn't bring a whiskey here, whatever it is. I just thought I didn't.
I had a fake wine last time.
Yeah, I was drinking fake wine myself right now because whatever. But I had juice here. But I'll ask you one more question, Manu, before letting you go. Who's doing interesting stuff? What are the interesting things? What do you find interesting in the food scenario in India right now? Who are the people who are doing interesting things? Where is it going? What are you watching that you find interesting?
Oh, lots of stuff. Well, see, interesting doesn't necessarily need to be like unique, path-breaking, new. Interesting just needs to be the passion that sort of backs it. And I'm seeing a very large number of chefs who stopped working at great restaurants that they were working at previously, started their own little ventures, doing these micro offerings. Some of them are ex-employees who are doing remarkable work, just outstanding ramen, which is waitlisted 4 weeks in advance. Somebody started off a little pizza business, which has now become a huge chain, but focused only on Neapolitan style pizzas, fresh cheese. I like what Hanisha and Jamshed are doing in Delhi. I look at the plates and I'm like, finally, some place in Delhi that is completely relatable, and it's arrived, and clearly they're very talented chefs. I don't know them personally that well. Maybe I met them somewhere in the offing, but their work speaks for itself, and that's really how it should be. That there are people across the country that are taking notice because the work is so good, and that's well, true merit. And then there's these pop-up venues that have come up, which provide an opportunity to a lot of people who can't possibly afford to have their own restaurant or whatever, showcase their skills. the biggest pop-up in the country right now is a state called Goa, which of course you can see every restaurant from every corner opening up over there. And of course, it's the gold rush, right? It's the California of the 1920s, where everyone sort of headed and saying this is where you make the money on F&B. It's just a matter of time before the flights open up to Bangkok and it becomes cheaper than Goa, and then you see how everything goes palat. But yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of bubble there, no doubt. But it's good because it's affording a lot of people great opportunities. I believe the real estate prices have gone up almost 4x. See, that's really what happens with every gold rush. So, but no, I definitely think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening in the CPG space and the FMCG space. Product lines are being developed which are completely unique. There's a lot of R&D going into it. You can see there's a lot of passion in the final offering. Packaged food has become better. So India is seeing a little bit of a renaissance as far as food is concerned, because of all these little endeavors that are coming together. Third-party manufacturing is really come a long way from where it used to be. So today, if you have a great idea, almost like an incubator, a third-party manufacturer can turn it out for you. So I think the food space is actually poised for substantial and very meaningful growth over the next few years. And I think anyone who can, ride that wave right now is going to be a very happy person at the end of it.
Okay, are there any other last questions that anyone wants to ask before we let Manu get some sleep? All right, so I think not. So I'm going to just steal what Janti has very kindly put in the chat, because she sort of summed up what I wanted to say. This was fabulous listening to you, Manu, to reflect on what it is meant to push benchmarks, to make new things relevant and make them work, and to establish something new. And it resonated with the work I am trying to do. This is Janvi saying that. And I second that as well, right? More so, I love it that you can say, I would like to now let go. I have done that in the past, and while it worries me, I want to always be ready to do so when it's time. And yeah, seconding that as well, because I've had a lot of trouble letting go and figuring out stuff, and watching what people like you and Janvi, for instance, who left a career in academia behind and has come off to start a science museum and a comfortable life, and to come and just try something very different. People like you, like Kishi, who's following her dreams, are all. I do these conversations because I learn from all of you. And Manu, thank you so much for sharing this time, for having this time.
So long, a long chat.
This is not the longest chat I've had. I mean, like I said, we have gone as long as 5 hours. So I am happy to go on for as long as that, because I'm a night person. But I am remembering that you have tasted 20 whiskeys, so I'm not going to push.
I'm also a morning person. I'm up by 5.
Yes. So yeah, extra thanks for staying up this late, for this conversation. Thank you so much, Manu. Thank you everyone who stayed and hung out with us. From the 12 of you who are here, from the around 30 who were here at the start. Thank you for staying. And the next table talk in a fortnight from now is a conversation where I'm inviting a number of people who've all been on table talk through the year. And if you have the time, Manu, join us as well. Kishi is going to be there, and a few others will be there as well, where we sort of look back on the year, if you have the time, in a fortnight from now. But for now, thank you, Manu Chandra. That was lovely, and a privilege to have this conversation with you.
The privilege is all mine. And we shall all catch up soon in the real world.
Yes, that is definitely something that I think we should all look forward to. But for now, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Manu.
Bye, guys.